Imagine you are about to be born into a society, but you do not know whether you will be rich or poor, healthy or sick, brilliant or ordinary. Now design the rules. This is the thought experiment that redefined political philosophy in the 20th century. Tonight we trace the life and ideas of John Rawls, the quiet Harvard professor, who transformed how we think about justice, fairness, and the structure of society itself. We will explore the veil of ignorance, the principles it generates, and why this single idea sparked decades of debate across philosophy, economics, law, and politics. We will meet a man who witnessed Hiroshima and returned home determined to answer an ancient question in a new way. We will follow the intellectual revolution that began with a book published in 1971 and continues to shape how governments justify policy, how courts interpret rights, and how ordinary people argue about what they owe one another. John Rawls was not a public intellectual in the modern sense. He gave few interviews, avoided television, and spent most of his career in the same Harvard office, teaching the same seminar year after year. His prose was careful to the point of caution, dense with qualifications and footnotes. He looked like what he was, a philosophy professor, slightly rumpled, invariably polite, more comfortable with ideas than audiences, and yet his influence spread far beyond the academy. Constitutional lawyers cite him. Economists build models around his principles. Activists invoke his thought experiment when demanding a fairer distribution of resources. Political theorists still organize their work as responses to his arguments, either extending them or tearing them down. How did this happen? How did a shy, methodical thinker become one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century? The answer begins with a problem that had troubled moral philosophers for generations. By the middle of the 20th century, the dominant framework for thinking about ethics and politics was utilitarianism, the view that the right action or policy is the one that produces the greatest total happiness or welfare. It was elegant, systematic, and seemingly scientific in its approach. You could in principle measure outcomes and calculate which choice would maximize utility. Governments found it useful. Economists built entire fields around it. But something felt wrong. Utilitarianism treats people as interchangeable units in a grand calculation. It cares about the total amount of happiness in a society, but not how that happiness is distributed. In principle, a utilitarian society could justify enslaving a minority if doing so made the majority sufficiently happy. It could sacrifice individual rights whenever the numbers tilted in favor of the collective good. It respected neither the separateness of persons nor the intuition that some things simply should not be done to people, no matter what benefits might follow. Rawls felt this tension acutely. He had served in the Pacific during World War II, first as an infantryman, and then in the aftermath of Japan's surrender. He was in the Philippines when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Later, he saw photographs of the devastation. He learned that his own unit had been preparing for the invasion of Japan, an invasion that would almost certainly have killed him and many of his fellow soldiers. The bombs had saved American lives, perhaps including his own. They had ended the war. By utilitarian logic, they might well have been justified. And yet something in Rawls recoiled. He began to lose his religious faith during the war, not because he stopped believing in God, but because he could not reconcile a just God with the world he was witnessing. When he returned to academia, he carried with him a conviction that morality could not simply be a matter of adding up costs and benefits. There had to be limits, principles, rights that could not be traded away for the sake of efficiency or aggregate welfare. But if utilitarianism was inadequate, what could replace it? Political philosophy in the mid-20th century was in a curious state. Many considered it a dead or dying field, a branch of inquiry that had been absorbed into empirical social science or reduced to conceptual analysis. The grand systematic theories of earlier centuries seemed quaint, products of a pre-scientific age. Rawls set out to prove otherwise. He returned to an older tradition, the social contract theory developed by Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and especially Kant. These thinkers had imagined political legitimacy as arising from a kind of agreement among free and equal people. The idea was powerful but also problematic. No such agreement had ever actually occurred, and even if it had, why should we be bound by choices made by people long dead? Rawls reimagined the contract not as a historical event, but as a thought experiment, a way of modeling what principles rational people would agree to under fair conditions. Justice, he argued, is fairness, and fairness requires that we choose principles without knowing how those principles will affect us personally. This is where the veil of ignorance enters. Rawls asks us to imagine a group of people gathered to choose the basic rules of their society. They are rational, self-interested, and capable of understanding complex principles, but they are behind a veil. They do not know their race, their gender, their social class, their natural talents, their conception of the good life, or their position in the society they are designing. They do not know if they will be born into wealth or poverty, health or disability, privilege or marginalization. They know only general facts about human psychology, economics, and social organization. Now Rawls asks, what principles would they choose? What rules would you agree to if you genuinely did not know whether you would end up at the top of society or the bottom, as the strongest or the weakest, as part of the majority or the minority? The veil strips away the biases and bargaining advantages that distort every real negotiation. It forces you to consider every perspective because you might occupy any of them. It is, Rawls believed, a device for modeling impartiality and fairness, and it leads, he argued, to surprising conclusions about liberty, equality, and the just distribution of resources. The principles chosen behind the veil would not be utilitarian, because no rational person would risk being the one sacrificed for the greater good. They would not be purely libertarian, because no one would gamble on a system that left the vulnerable to fend for themselves. Instead, Rawls proposed they would choose two principles. First, that each person has an equal claim to a fully adequate scheme of basic liberties. And second, that social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. These principles, he believed, capture what we mean when we call a society just. When a theory of justice appeared in 1971, it was as if a door that had been closed for decades suddenly swung open. Here was a systematic, rigorous defense of liberal egalitarianism that took individual rights seriously while still demanding attention to the worst off. It spoke to the political moment, a time of civil rights struggles, debates about the welfare state, and growing concerns about inequality. But it also transcended that moment, offering a framework that could be argued with, built upon, and tested against intuitions and principles. The book revitalized political philosophy as a discipline. It gave philosophers, lawyers, and political theorists a common language and a shared set of problems. It sparked fierce debates that continue to this day. Not everyone was convinced. Libertarians like Robert Nozick argued that justice is about respecting rights and property, not redistributing goods. Egalitarians and feminists charged that Rawls did not go far enough, that his theory ignored injustices within families or failed to account for the full range of human disadvantages. Communitarians insisted that justice cannot be derived from abstract individuals stripped of their cultural identities and traditions. Cosmopolitans asked why the veil should stop at national borders, and philosophers of all stripes debated the status of the thought experiment itself. Was it a proof, a heuristic, or merely an intuition pump? Rawls engaged with these critics thoughtfully, revising and refining his ideas over decades. But the core insight remained: fairness requires impartiality, and impartiality requires that we imagine ourselves in the position of others. What follows is the story of how that insight emerged, what it means and why it matters. We will walk through Rawls's life, from his childhood in Baltimore to his final years at Harvard, tracing the experiences and influences that shaped his thinking. We will examine the veil of ignorance in detail, understanding its mechanics and its purpose. We will explore the principles it generates and the fierce debates they provoked. We will see how Rawls extended his theory to questions of international justice and political legitimacy in pluralistic societies, and we will ask what his legacy means for us now, in a world still struggling with deep inequalities and fundamental disagreements about what we owe one another. To understand why Rawls's theory felt like a revelation, we must first understand what it replaced and why the philosophical ground was ready for a new foundation. John Rawls was born on February 21, 1921, in Baltimore, Maryland, into a world that seemed ordered and comprehensible. His father was a prominent attorney. His mother came from a well-established family. The household valued education, civic duty, and Protestant earnestness. Young Jack, as he was called, showed early intellectual promise. He attended private schools where he excelled in languages and mathematics. Everything pointed toward a conventional path: good university, respectable profession, quiet contribution to the established order. But the 20th century had other plans. Two events shattered the orderliness of his childhood. When Rawls was 7 years old, his younger brother contracted diphtheria from him and died. A year later, another brother contracted pneumonia, also from Rawls, and died as well. The weight of these losses, the terrible randomness of who lives and who dies, marked him permanently. He did not speak of it often, but friends and students would later note something in his demeanor, a seriousness about moral questions that went beyond intellectual curiosity. It was as if he understood, at a cellular level, that the distribution of fortune and misfortune is morally arbitrary, that where you start in life owes nothing to your own choices or merits. Rawls attended Princeton University, where he studied philosophy and showed exceptional aptitude for rigorous argument. He graduated in 1943, at the height of the Second World War, and immediately enlisted in the United States Army. He served as an infantryman in the Pacific Theater, part of the grinding campaign to push Japanese forces back island by island. He saw combat in New Guinea and the Philippines. Then, in the summer of 1945, his unit was preparing for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. The invasion was cancelled. Rawls was sent to occupied Japan as part of the reconstruction effort. What he saw there left a mark every bit as deep as the childhood deaths. He walked through what remained of Hiroshima, the scale of destruction, the civilian suffering, the sheer efficiency with which modern technology could obliterate human life. All of it confronted him with questions that philosophy had to answer. How do we think about justice after Hiroshima? How do we build moral frameworks that can constrain state power and prevent such horrors? How do we ensure that individuals with their fragile and irreplaceable lives are not simply erased for the sake of some larger calculation? These were not abstract puzzles, they were urgent moral demands. After the war, Rawls returned to Princeton for graduate study. He completed his doctorate in 1950 and began teaching, first at Princeton, then at Cornell, and finally at Harvard, where he would spend most of his career. He was not a charismatic lecturer. He spoke softly, sometimes hesitantly. He revised his notes endlessly, never satisfied that he had expressed an idea with sufficient clarity or precision. Students who took his seminars remember a man who treated their objections with utmost seriousness, who would pause for long stretches to think through a counter-argument, who seemed almost painfully aware of the difficulty of getting anything right in philosophy. He was shy, methodical, deeply private. He avoided the limelight. He published slowly. For decades, his reputation rested on a handful of articles that circulated among specialists. But those articles were doing something important. They were clearing ground for a new approach to political philosophy. Because the intellectual landscape of mid-century America was dominated by a single framework, and that framework was starting to show cracks. The reigning orthodoxy was utilitarianism, the view that the right action or policy is the one that maximizes overall happiness or welfare. It was elegant, it was systematic, it offered clear guidance: add up the benefits, subtract the costs, choose whatever produces the greatest total good. Economists loved it because it could be modeled. Policymakers loved it because it promised rational optimization. And philosophers had been refining it for more than a century, from Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill through to modern figures like Henry Sidgwick. But utilitarianism had a problem. It treated individuals as mere vessels for utility, interchangeable units in a grand social calculus. If torturing one innocent person would somehow produce enough happiness for enough others, utilitarianism could justify it. If enslaving a minority would maximize total welfare, The theory had no principled way to rule it out. The framework seemed to miss something fundamental about justice, that each person matters separately, that individual rights are not just inputs in an optimization equation, that some things are simply wrong no matter what the aggregate consequences. Rawls was not alone in feeling this dissatisfaction. A generation of philosophers trained in the rigorous methods of analytic philosophy was beginning to ask whether ethical theory could do better, but political philosophy itself was in a peculiar state. Many regarded it as essentially finished, a relic of an earlier era. The serious work, people said, was being done in logic, language, and metaphysics. Grand theories about justice and the structure of society seemed hopelessly vague, infected with ideology, unsuited to the precise methods that had made analytic philosophy respectable. Political philosophy was derivative at best, dead at worst. Into this climate, Rawls brought something unexpected. He brought the patience and precision of analytic philosophy to questions of justice. He took the utilitarian commitment to systematic theory but rejected its willingness to sacrifice individuals for the collective. He reached back to an older tradition, the social contract theories of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and above all Immanuel Kant, and he rebuilt that tradition with modern tools. He asked what principles would free and equal people agree to if they were choosing the basic structure of their society under conditions that were genuinely fair. The question sounds simple. The answer would reshape political philosophy for the next half-century. But to understand why it worked, why it felt like such a revelation when it finally appeared in print, you have to understand the void it filled. You have to see how tired the old frameworks had become, how hungry philosophers and citizens alike were for a theory that respected both individual rights and the demands of equality, that could guide real institutions without collapsing into relativism or ideology. Rawls spent the 1950s and 60s working out the details, publishing articles with titles like Justice as Fairness and The Sense of Justice that sketched the outlines of his project. He tested his ideas in seminars. He revised constantly. He corresponded with other philosophers, absorbing objections, refining arguments. By the late 1960s, he was circulating drafts of a manuscript that pulled everything together, and in 1971, Harvard University Press published A Theory of Justice, a book of nearly 600 pages that laid out a complete systematic account of justice for modern democratic societies. The reaction was immediate. Here was rigorous philosophy that spoke to the deepest political questions of the moment. Here was a defense of equality that did not rest on fuzzy intuitions or partisan commitments, but on a thought experiment that anyone could engage with. Here was a liberal theory that took rights seriously, that could not be accused of sacrificing the individual to the collective. And here was a challenge. If you disagreed, you had to say why. You had to offer your own principles, your own thought experiment, your own account of what makes a society just. To understand why Rawls's theory felt like a revelation, we must first understand what it replaced and why the philosophical ground was ready for a new foundation. By the middle of the 20th century, one moral philosophy dominated English-speaking academic departments, shaped public policy debates, and provided the framework through which serious thinkers approached questions of right and wrong. That philosophy was utilitarianism, and its central claim possessed an elegant simplicity that seemed almost self-evident. The right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Maximize happiness, minimize suffering, add up the consequences and choose the path that yields the highest total. What could be more rational than that? Jeremy Bentham had crystallized this idea in the late 18th century, proposing that pleasure and pain were the sovereign masters of human existence, and that morality should be nothing more than their careful calculation. John Stuart Mill refined it in the 19th century, introducing distinctions between higher and lower pleasures and defending individual liberty as instrumentally valuable for human flourishing. By the time Rawls began his philosophical career in the 1950s, utilitarianism had evolved into sophisticated variants, but the core remained. Aggregate welfare is what matters, and justice means arranging society to maximize it. The appeal was undeniable. Utilitarianism offered a systematic method for resolving moral disputes. It was egalitarian in a certain sense, counting each person's happiness as equal in the calculus. It was practical, focusing on outcomes rather than abstract principles. It could guide policy decisions about everything from taxation to criminal punishment to resource distribution. You could measure, compare, optimize. In a century that had witnessed devastating wars and the rise of massive governmental bureaucracies, a moral philosophy that promised to calculate the best outcomes for the most people seemed not just useful but necessary. But there was something that troubled Rawls about this framework, something that had troubled others before him but that he would articulate with particular force. Utilitarianism treated individuals as mere locations where happiness or suffering could occur. You were a container for utility, and what mattered was not you specifically, but the total quantity of good in all the containers combined. If sacrificing your interests would produce greater aggregate happiness, then utilitarian logic demanded that sacrifice, the numbers were what counted. Consider a simple example. A society must decide whether to permit the torture of one innocent person if doing so would prevent a terrorist attack that would kill 100 people. The utilitarian calculation seems straightforward. One person's suffering versus 100 deaths, countless grieving families, widespread trauma in the community. The aggregate welfare clearly favors torture. Yet something recoils at this conclusion. Something insists that there are limits to what can be done to an individual, regardless of the collective benefit. Or imagine a surgeon who has 5 patients dying of organ failure and 1 healthy patient in the waiting room. Could the surgeon kill the healthy patient and distribute the organs to save 5 lives? The utilitarian arithmetic is clear. 5 lives saved, 1 life lost, net gain of 4 lives, plus all the future happiness those 4 saved people will experience. Yet we recognize this as murder, not as optimal social policy. We do not simply add up the happiness units and conclude that the surgeon acted rightly. These examples might seem extreme, but they point to a fundamental problem. Utilitarianism lacks a principled basis for protecting individual rights. It can justify any action, no matter how intuitively unjust, if the numbers work out favorably. You could enslave a minority if doing so produced enough happiness for the majority. You could execute an innocent person to prevent riots if the social peace generated more aggregate welfare than the injustice destroyed. You could redistribute all resources to produce marginally more total utility, even if doing so violated every intuition about fairness, desert, and personal entitlement. The philosopher H.J. McCloskey posed a vivid case in 1965. Imagine a small town where a terrible crime has occurred and racial tensions are inflaming toward violence. The sheriff knows the real criminal has escaped, but he also knows that framing and executing an innocent member of the minority group would calm the unrest and prevent much greater bloodshed. Should he do it? The utilitarian seems forced to say yes, if the prevention of riots and deaths truly outweighs the injustice of one wrongful execution. But that answer betrays something essential about justice. What utilitarianism failed to respect, in Rawls's view, was what he would later call the separateness of persons. You and I are not simply 2 locations in a single experiential field where pleasures and pains occur. We are distinct individuals, each living a life from the inside, each with our own projects and commitments and boundaries. What happens to you is not compensated by what happens to me, no matter how much happiness I experience. The loss of your freedom cannot be made right by an increase in someone else's pleasure. We are separate, and that separateness places moral constraints on how we can be treated. John Stuart Mill himself had sensed this problem and tried to patch the theory. He insisted that individual liberty was so instrumentally valuable for human happiness that it must be protected even when specific violations might seem to produce better short-term outcomes. Better to have a general rule protecting freedom, even if particular exceptions might maximize utility, because the long-run consequences of respecting liberty were superior. But this was a pragmatic defense, not a principled one. It made individual rights hostage to empirical claims about consequences. If it turned out that systematic oppression actually produced more aggregate happiness than freedom, then Mill's modified utilitarianism would have to endorse oppression. The utilitarian framework also struggled with distribution. Suppose society A has 10 people, each experiencing 10 units of happiness, for a total of 100. Society B has 9 people experiencing 1 unit each, and 1 person experiencing 92 units, for a total of 101. By purely utilitarian logic, Society B is better, even though it contains vastly more inequality and 9 people living in near misery. Total utility is what counts, not how it is distributed. You could justify a society where most people suffer terribly as long as a small elite experiences such extreme pleasure that the aggregate comes out ahead. Rawls was not alone in these concerns. The philosopher Bernard Williams had criticized utilitarianism for demanding too much, for requiring individuals to treat their own projects and commitments as having no more weight than anyone else's. The concept of moral integrity seemed to evaporate when you are obligated to maximize impersonal aggregate welfare rather than to live according to your own values and relationships. Thomas Nagel would later articulate how utilitarianism failed to capture the moral significance of how something happens, focusing only on outcomes while ignoring the means by which they are achieved. But criticism was not enough. Philosophy in the mid-20th century had largely accepted that if you rejected utilitarianism, you were left with intuitions, scattered principles, and no systematic theory at all. The great virtue of utilitarianism was its comprehensiveness, its ability to provide guidance on any moral question whatsoever. You might dislike its conclusions in particular cases, but what was the alternative? Appeals to natural rights seemed to rest on mysterious metaphysical claims about human nature. Appeals to divine command required theological commitments that a pluralistic society could not assume. Appeals to intuition seemed arbitrary and subjective. What Rawls sought was a theory that could match utilitarianism's systematic scope and practical guidance, while respecting the separateness of persons and providing genuine protections for individual rights. He wanted a framework that did not depend on summing up happiness across different lives, that did not treat people as interchangeable units in a moral calculus, that recognized each person as an end in themselves, rather than a mere means to collective welfare. He wanted a theory of justice, not just a theory of optimal outcomes. The question was how to construct such a theory without abandoning the aspiration to rational, universal moral principles. How could you respect individuals as separate and equal without descending into relativism or mere assertion? How could you justify principles of justice in a way that was systematic and compelling, but that did not reduce persons to vessels for utility? If utilitarianism could not protect the individual from being sacrificed for the whole, what could? Rawls turned to an old philosophical tradition and reimagined it for the modern world. The problem with utilitarianism was not that it ignored fairness. The problem was deeper. It had no satisfactory account of why fairness matters in the first place. If all that counts is maximizing total welfare, then the distribution of that welfare becomes a mere instrument, valuable only insofar as it serves the greater sum. But this felt wrong to Rawls, and he knew he was not alone. He needed a framework that could explain why justice is not simply a useful tool for producing good outcomes, but something that constrains what outcomes we may pursue. He needed a theory that began with persons as separate, irreducible, deserving of respect not because they contribute to aggregate happiness, but because they are moral agents. He found his starting point in an old tradition, one that had fallen somewhat out of fashion but never entirely disappeared: the social contract. The idea of a social contract stretches back centuries, appearing in different forms across European political thought. At its core, the concept is deceptively simple. Political authority, the legitimacy of the state, the rules that bind us together, these do not descend from heaven or emerge from nature or impose themselves by force alone. They arise, or ought to arise, from some form of agreement among the people who will live under them. This is the fundamental insight. Justice is not discovered through revelation or intuition, but constructed through consent. We are bound by the terms we would accept, not the terms imposed upon us. Thomas Hobbes introduced one of the earliest and starkest versions in the 17th century. In his view, people in a state of nature, without government, without law, would live in a condition of perpetual war, driven by competition, fear, and the pursuit of glory. Life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this nightmare, rational individuals would agree to surrender their natural freedom to a sovereign power capable of enforcing peace. The contract for Hobbes was born of mutual advantage. We give up our liberty to kill and take in exchange for security and order. The legitimacy of government rests on this bargain, however grim its origins. John Locke offered a gentler version a generation later. His state of nature was less hellish, governed by natural law and a basic recognition of rights to life, liberty, and property. But even in this more peaceable condition, disputes would arise, and without an impartial judge, conflicts would escalate. People would therefore consent to form a government to protect their natural rights more effectively than they could alone. The contract for Locke was not an escape from chaos, but a refinement of natural justice. Government exists to secure what we already possess, and if it fails to do so, the contract is broken. Jean-Jacques Rousseau complicated the picture further in the 18th century. He asked a troubling question: if the social contract is supposed to establish freedom, why does it so often result in domination and inequality? His answer was that most existing contracts are corrupt, reflecting not genuine consent, but the manipulation of the weak by the strong. A legitimate contract, Rousseau argued, would express the general will, the collective judgment of the people about what serves the common good. Only such a contract could reconcile individual freedom with political authority, because in obeying the general will, we would be obeying a law we gave ourselves. These theories shared a common structure, hypothetical agreement as the foundation of legitimacy, but they differed sharply in their assumptions about human nature, the purpose of government, and the content of the agreement. Hobbes emphasized security, Locke emphasized rights, Rousseau emphasized freedom and equality. Each offered a vision of what rational people would agree to and why, yet each was also vulnerable to an obvious objection: no such contract ever actually occurred. We are born into societies with established rules, inheriting obligations we never personally consented to. If the contract is purely fictional, what work is it really doing? Immanuel Kant saw this problem clearly and transformed the social contract tradition in response. For Kant, the contract need not be historical. Its purpose is not to describe how governments actually formed, but to provide a standard for judging their legitimacy. A just law is one that could have been agreed to by free and rational persons. The question is not whether you actually consented, but whether you could have rationally consented if given the choice. This moves the contract from history to philosophy, from fact to principle. It becomes a test of justification rather than a theory of origins. Kant's influence on Rawls runs deeper still. At the heart of Kantian ethics is the idea that persons possess dignity by virtue of their rational autonomy. We are not merely objects in the world, subject to causal forces and natural impulses. We are agents capable of self-governance, of acting according to principles we endorse. To treat someone as an end in themselves, rather than merely as a means, is to respect their capacity for rational self-determination. This is why manipulating people, lying to them, or using them for your purposes violates their dignity. It treats them as tools rather than as autonomous beings who have their own reasons and purposes. Rawls absorbed this Kantian framework and translated it into political philosophy. If persons are autonomous, then the principles governing their collective life must be ones they could rationally endorse. If persons are equals in their moral status, then no one's interests or judgments should count for more simply because of who they are. Justice, therefore, cannot be imposed from above or derived from a single comprehensive moral doctrine. It must emerge from a process that respects each person's standing as a free and equal participant in shaping the terms of their cooperation. But here is where Rawls departed from his predecessors, including Kant. A contract formed under real-world conditions is inevitably shaped by power, wealth, knowledge, and bargaining skill. The strong extract better terms than the weak. Those with resources can wait longer, threaten more credibly, and demand more favorable arrangements. Even if everyone technically agrees, the outcome may still be unjust because the agreement reflects unequal power, rather than genuine fairness. Hobbes was right that we would agree to escape anarchy, but the terms we agree to depend on our relative strength. Locke was right that we value rights, but which rights get protected may depend on who has the loudest voice. Rousseau saw the danger, but could not solve it, because the general will itself can be corrupted by inequality and domination. Rawls understood that a fair contract requires fair conditions. The agreement must be made from a position of equality, not in the shadow of existing disparities. To model this, he needed a hypothetical scenario, stripped of the distortions that compromise real negotiations. He needed a device that would ensure impartiality, without simply assuming what justice requires. He needed to construct a situation where the principles chosen would be fair, not because someone declared them fair, but because the choosing itself guaranteed it. This is what Rawls called justice, as fairness. Justice is not primarily about outcomes, though outcomes matter. It is about the fairness of the process by which principles are chosen. If free and equal persons, reasoning fairly, would agree to certain principles, then those principles are just. The contract is hypothetical, but the fairness it models is real. It asks, what would you agree to if you could not rig the game in your favor? What principles would you choose if you had to live with them, not knowing where you would end up? This shift from historical to hypothetical contract was not an evasion but a clarification. Rawls was not trying to explain how societies actually formed or why we should obey existing governments. He was trying to identify principles of justice that could command rational assent from all members of a society considered as free and equal persons. The social contract becomes a tool for moral reasoning, a way of asking what we owe each other when we strip away the accidents of power and circumstance. But how do we ensure the contract is truly fair? How do we strip away the biases and power imbalances that distort every real negotiation? Rawls had an answer, and it was radical. The contract tradition offered Rawls a foundation, but foundations require architecture. He needed a mechanism that could generate principles of justice without smuggling in the very biases and inequalities those principles were meant to address. The challenge was ancient. How do you design fair rules when every designer brings prejudices, interests, and advantages to the table? Rawls' answer became the most famous thought experiment in 20th century political philosophy. He called it the original position. Picture a gathering where principles of justice are to be chosen, not discovered or revealed, but actively selected by rational people who will live under them. This is not a historical moment, not a founding convention or constitutional assembly. It exists nowhere and never. It is a device of representation, a way of modeling what fairness requires when we strip away everything that corrupts impartial judgment. The original position asks you to imagine yourself among these choosers. You sit with others, all tasked with selecting the basic structure of society, the fundamental political, economic, and social institutions that will shape every life from birth to death. You must agree on principles. You must reach consensus. But there is a twist, and it changes everything. You do not know who you are. This is the veil of ignorance, and it descends over the original position like a curtain hiding the stage before a play begins. Behind this veil, certain facts about yourself become inaccessible. You do not know your race. You do not know your class or social status. You do not know your gender. You do not know your natural talents, your intelligence, your strength, your beauty, or lack thereof. You do not know your conception of the good life, your deepest values, or your religious and philosophical commitments. You do not even know your own psychology, your particular aversions to risk, your temperament or disposition. What you do know is general. You understand how societies function. You grasp basic facts about human psychology, economics, and political organization. You know that people have different conceptions of the good and that they care about their own lives and projects. You know what primary goods are, the things any rational person would want, regardless of what else they want. Liberty, opportunity, income, wealth, the social basis of self-respect. These matter to nearly every life plan, but you do not know which life plan is yours. The veil is not a pretense of stupidity. You remain rational, capable of reasoning about consequences and probabilities. You simply lack the specific information that would let you tailor principles to benefit yourself at others' expense. Rawls was scrupulous about what the veil hides and what it leaves visible. Too much ignorance, and you cannot reason at all. Too little, and partiality creeps back in. The line must be drawn precisely where self-interest can no longer distort judgment about fairness. Why does this ignorance ensure impartiality? The logic is almost ruthlessly simple. You cannot design rules to favor yourself if you do not know who you are. You cannot privilege your race if you do not know your race. You cannot protect your wealth if you do not know whether you have any. You cannot encode your religion into law if you do not know which religion, if any, you hold. The veil forces you to consider every possible position you might occupy once it lifts. You might be born wealthy or destitute. You might be gifted or disabled. You might belong to the majority or a despised minority. Any principle you endorse must be one you could accept from any of these positions. This is the device modeling fairness and rationality simultaneously. Fairness because the conditions are symmetrical. Everyone behind the veil faces the same ignorance, the same task, the same stakes. No one can rig the game because no one knows what place they will occupy when the game begins. Rationality because the people in the original position are not saints or altruists. They want to do well for themselves. They simply cannot identify which principles serve their interests until they know their interests, and the veil prevents that knowledge. So rationality itself pushes them toward impartiality. The thought experiment works by converting self-interest into a force for justice rather than against it. You choose principles that protect everyone because you might be anyone. Your rational self-concern becomes concern for all possible selves you could turn out to be. Rawls sometimes described this as choice under uncertainty, borrowing language from decision theory. When you do not know which outcome will obtain, you must weigh all possibilities. The veil of ignorance applies this logic to the most important choice imaginable, the basic structure of the society in which you will spend your entire life. The elegance lies in the setup. Rawls does not demand that people become selfless or enlightened. He does not ask them to love their neighbors or cultivate virtue. He simply asks what self-interested, rational individuals would agree to under fair conditions. The fairness is built into the conditions of choice, not assumed in the character of the choosers. The original position does not require moral heroism. It requires only that we think clearly about what we would want if we could not stack the deck in our favor. But the veil of ignorance is widely misunderstood, and these misunderstandings reveal something important about how thought experiments function in philosophy. Some critics treat the veil as if Rawls were proposing actual ignorance as a virtue, or suggesting that real people should somehow forget their identities when making political decisions. This misses the point entirely. The veil is not a practical recommendation. No one is supposed to don a veil and wander into a voting booth. The original position is not a procedure to be enacted, but a test to be applied. It asks, would these principles be chosen under fair conditions? If yes, they have a claim to being just. If no, we have reason to reconsider them. Others object that the veil asks too much, that stripping away everything particular about a person leaves only an abstract husk, incapable of meaningful choice. But Rawls is not trying to describe actual human beings. He is modeling the standpoint of fairness itself, the perspective from which we can assess principles without bias. The people in the original position are not meant to be psychologically realistic. They are meant to represent what we, with all our particularity intact, would judge to be fair terms of cooperation if we reasoned impartially. Still others worry that the veil smuggles in assumptions, that what counts as rational choice behind the veil depends on Rawls's own liberal values. This criticism has more weight. The veil does not operate in a vacuum. Rawls specifies what the parties know and what they want, and those specifications shape what principles emerge. But every thought experiment rests on some setup, and the question is whether the setup captures something important about fairness or merely reflects the prejudices of its designer. Rawls invites us to test the veil by seeing whether its results match our considered judgments about justice, If they diverge, we must ask whether the veil needs adjustment or our judgments need revision. The veil of ignorance became, almost immediately, a fixture of moral and political argument far beyond academic philosophy. It appears in courtrooms, legislative debates, and casual conversations about fairness. People invoke it instinctively when they say, "Imagine if it were you, imagine if you did not know which side you would be on." The power of the thought experiment lies partly in how readily it translates from technical philosophy to ordinary reasoning. We already think this way, at least sometimes. Rawls simply formalized and radicalized an intuition most people already have, that fairness requires setting aside our particular advantages and considering the perspective of others. Once the veil is in place, what principles emerge? What would you choose if you truly did not know your fate? Behind the veil, stripped of all knowledge about your future position in society, you face a choice. What rules would govern the world you are about to enter? Rawls believed the answer would emerge not from moral intuition or religious authority, but from rational self-interest constrained by radical uncertainty. If you cannot know whether you will be born into wealth or poverty, health or disability, genius or limitation, what principles would you demand as protection? What structure would you insist upon before agreeing to enter the lottery of existence? The answer Rawls proposed came in two parts, two principles that together formed what he called justice as fairness. They were not arbitrary. They were not merely his personal preferences elevated to philosophical doctrine. They were, he argued, the inevitable conclusion of rational choice under conditions of genuine impartiality. Behind the veil, every person becomes a careful architect of society, knowing they must live in the house they design, but not knowing which room will be theirs. The first principle concerns liberty itself. Each person, Rawls argued, has an equal claim to a fully adequate scheme of basic liberties compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. This is not a vague platitude about freedom. It specifies a particular set of rights and protections. Political liberty including the right to vote and hold office, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person, including protection from psychological oppression and physical assault, the right to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure. These are the fundamental liberties that define what it means to be a free and equal citizen in a democratic society. What matters most about this first principle is not merely its content, but its absolute priority. Liberty, in Rawls' framework, cannot be traded away for economic advantage or aggregate welfare. You cannot bargain away freedom of speech for a higher standard of living. You cannot sacrifice political rights for greater efficiency. The basic liberties are, in a profound sense, non-negotiable. They stand as a firewall against the utilitarian calculus that might justify restricting some people's freedom to maximize overall happiness. Why would rational people behind the veil insist on this priority? Because liberty is the foundation of everything else. Without basic freedoms, you cannot pursue your conception of the good life, whatever that might be. Without political rights, you become vulnerable to the whims of those with power. Without freedom of conscience, your deepest convictions can be suppressed by majority rule. Behind the veil, not knowing whether your beliefs will be popular or heretical, whether your interests will align with the majority or mark you as an outsider, you would demand robust protection for fundamental liberties before agreeing to any social arrangement. You would not gamble with freedom. But liberty alone does not complete the picture. A society could guarantee equal political and civil rights while tolerating vast economic inequality, grinding poverty, and wildly unequal opportunities. This brings us to the second principle, which governs what Rawls called social and economic inequalities. Here the architecture becomes more intricate. The second principle contains two distinct requirements. First, positions and offices must be open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. This is stronger than merely formal equality, which says only that discriminatory barriers should be removed. Fair equality of opportunity demands that people with similar talents and willingness to use them should have similar prospects of success, regardless of their initial economic or social position. It is not enough to open the doors if some children receive excellent education, nutritious food, stable homes, and enrichment opportunities, while others struggle with inadequate schools, hunger, instability, and deprivation. True opportunity requires leveling the playing field so that talent and effort, not accidents of birth, determine outcomes. But even fair equality of opportunity leaves room for significant inequality. Some people have greater talents, work harder, or simply get luckier in ways the system cannot fully control. This is where the second part of the second principle enters, the difference principle. Social and economic inequalities, Rawls argued, are justified only if they work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. This is a remarkable claim. It does not demand absolute equality of wealth or income. It permits inequality, even substantial inequality, but only under a very specific condition. The inequalities must serve the interests of those at the bottom. If allowing doctors to earn more than laborers incentivizes people to undergo lengthy training and creates better healthcare for everyone, including the poorest, then that inequality is justified. If allowing entrepreneurs to accumulate wealth spurs innovation that raises living standards across society, including for the least well-off, that inequality is acceptable. But if inequality exists simply because the powerful can extract more, or because markets generate arbitrary windfalls that do not benefit the disadvantaged, then those inequalities fail the test of justice. The difference principle reflects a particular kind of reasoning available only behind the veil. You do not know whether you will be talented or ordinary, healthy or sick, born into a supportive family or a troubled one. Given this uncertainty, would you gamble on a libertarian system that protects property rights but offers no safety net, hoping you will be among the lucky? Would you accept a utilitarian system that might sacrifice your interests if doing so marginally increases aggregate welfare? Or would you insist on a structure that guarantees you a decent life even in the worst case, even if you turn out to be among the least advantaged? Rawls believed rational self-interest points decisively toward the difference principle. It embodies what he called maximum reasoning, maximizing the minimum position. You design society to make the worst-off position as good as possible, because you might occupy that position yourself. This is not altruism. It is not a moral duty to help the poor. It is rational prudence transformed into a principle of justice through the device of the veil. Critics immediately notice that this reasoning depends on a particular attitude toward risk. Someone willing to gamble might prefer a libertarian system with the chance of great wealth and the risk of poverty over a Rawlsian system that limits both extremes. But Rawls had an answer. Behind the veil, you are not just choosing for yourself. You are choosing principles that will govern society for generations, affecting your children and their children. In such circumstances, gambling seems irresponsible. The stakes are too high, the consequences too permanent to treat social justice as a casino bet. There is something deeply intuitive about this reasoning, and yet something that troubles many who encounter it. The difference principle asks us to imagine ourselves as potentially anyone, and from that perspective, to care most about the fate of the worst off. It inverts the usual logic of political debate, where those who have succeeded often see themselves as deserving and view help for the disadvantaged as charity or burden. Rawls asks us to recognize that the line between success and struggle is thinner than we like to believe, drawn partly by luck we did not earn and circumstances we did not choose. The two principles work together as an integrated system. Liberty comes first, establishing the basic framework of rights and freedoms that cannot be compromised. Within that framework, fair equality of opportunity ensures that positions are genuinely open based on talent and effort, and the difference principle regulates how much inequality can emerge from the exercise of those talents and efforts, demanding that any inequality must justify itself by benefiting those who have the least. This is the world Rawls believed rational people would design if they could not rig the game in their own favor. It is not utopia. It permits significant inequality. It does not guarantee happiness or eliminate all unfairness. but it establishes a structure that respects each person as free and equal, protects fundamental liberties, ensures meaningful opportunity, and makes the well-being of the most vulnerable a central criterion of justice. These principles sound simple, but they carry profound implications for how we structure economies, distribute resources, and design institutions. The debates began almost immediately. 3 years after Rawls published his theory of justice, a younger philosopher at Harvard delivered a manuscript to the same press that had released that landmark volume. Robert Nozick was brilliant, provocative, and about to offer the most sustained challenge Rawls would face from the political right. The book was titled Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and it argued something startling, that Rawls had gotten justice almost entirely backward. Justice was not about patterns of distribution or helping the least advantaged. It was about rights, property, and leaving people alone. Nozick began with a question that flipped the burden of proof. Why should there be a state at all? Most political philosophers assumed the existence of government and then debated what it should do. Nozick started from anarchy and asked what could possibly justify coercive institutions. His answer was minimal. A state could protect people from force, theft, and fraud. It could enforce contracts. Beyond that, almost nothing. Any state that redistributed wealth, regulated markets, or pursued patterned visions of justice was violating rights. This was not merely a disagreement about policy, it was a frontal assault on the entire Rawlsian project. At the heart of Nozick's argument was what he called the entitlement theory of justice. Justice in holdings, he claimed, had nothing to do with how resources were distributed across society. It had everything to do with how you came to possess what you have. There were 3 principles. First, justice in acquisition. If you acquire something without violating anyone's rights, it is yours. Second, justice in transfer. If someone voluntarily gives you something, it is now yours. Third, rectification. If something was acquired or transferred unjustly, justice requires correcting that wrong. That was it. No mention of the least advantaged. No concern for overall patterns. If your holdings arose through just acquisition and just transfer, they were just, period. End of story. This framework led Nozick to reject any redistributive taxation as a form of forced labor. If the state takes a portion of what you earned through your work, it is claiming a right to your labor. It is treating you as a means to someone else's ends. Nozick saw this as incompatible with self-ownership, the idea that you have sovereign control over your own body and the fruits of your labor. Rawls's difference principle, which allowed inequalities only if they benefited the least well-off, required continuous state intervention to maintain a desired pattern of distribution. Every time people engaged in free exchange, they would disrupt that pattern. The state would need to step in, take from some, give to others, adjust and readjust. For Nozick, this was not justice, it was tyranny with good intentions. To illustrate the point, Nozick offered one of the most famous thought experiments in political philosophy, one that came to be known as the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. Imagine, he said, that we start with whatever distribution Rawls or any patterned theorist considers perfectly just. Everyone has exactly what they should have according to the preferred principle. Now suppose that Wilt Chamberlain, a wildly popular basketball player, signs a contract anyone who wants to watch him play can drop 25 cents into a special box, and he gets to keep that money. Over the course of the season, 1 million people attend games. They each voluntarily pay the quarter. Chamberlain ends up with $250,000, far more than most people. The distribution is no longer equal. The pattern has been disrupted. But what exactly is unjust about this situation? Each person who paid did so freely. No one was coerced. No rights were violated. Chamberlain provided entertainment. People valued it. They chose to pay. If we now think the resulting distribution is unjust, the only way to correct it is to take money from Chamberlain, to prevent people from paying him, or to prohibit the very transactions that led to the inequality. Yet each of those options, Nozick argued, violates liberty. Maintaining any patterned distribution requires constant interference with free exchange. Liberty upsets patterns. You cannot have both a strong commitment to liberty and a strong commitment to a particular distributive pattern, like the difference principle. You must choose. Rawls had prioritized liberty in his first principle. Of course, basic liberties were inviolable. But for Nozick, this was not enough. Economic liberty, the freedom to buy and sell and trade and accumulate, was inseparable from other freedoms. Rawls treated economic arrangements as subject to social choice, constrained by the difference principle. Nozick saw this as treating some liberties as second class, available only insofar as they served the right distributive outcome. The deeper disagreement was about what kind of entity a society even was. For Rawls, society was a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, and justice governed the terms of that cooperation. For Nozick, there was no such entity as society with moral standing independent of the individuals who composed it. There were only people, each with rights, interacting freely or not. This was more than a technical dispute among philosophers. It reflected and shaped broader political debates that were intensifying throughout the 1970s. Rawls published at a moment when the post-war liberal consensus was fraying. Faith in government, in redistribution, in collective solutions was weakening. Nozick gave intellectual voice to an emerging libertarian and conservative critique. His book became a rallying point for those who believed that equality and social justice, as noble as they sounded, threatened freedom. It was no accident that anarchy, state, and utopia appeared just as political tides were shifting toward deregulation, tax cuts, and skepticism about the welfare state. The clash between Rawls and Nozick was personal as well as philosophical. They were colleagues at Harvard, and by all accounts they respected each other, but their arguments could not have been more opposed. Nozick thought Rawls gave far too much power to the state and treated individuals as resources to be allocated. Rawls thought Nozick ignored the morally arbitrary nature of initial endowments and the way unregulated markets could entrench vast inequalities that no one behind the veil of ignorance would accept. Each saw the other as missing something essential about justice. Each thought the other's vision, taken seriously, would lead to moral disaster. Rawls responded to Nozick, though not directly in the way some expected. He clarified that the difference principle was not a call for constant redistribution, but a principle for designing basic institutions. The goal was not to control every transaction, but to structure background institutions so that inequalities worked to everyone's advantage over time. He also argued that self-ownership, as Nozick understood it, was not some natural fact but a moral claim that itself needed justification. Why should you own all the rewards that flow from talents you did nothing to deserve? Why should accidents of birth translate into permanent advantage? But Nozick had raised questions that would not go away. Even those sympathetic to Rawls had to grapple with the tension between pattern justice and economic liberty. Even those who found libertarianism too extreme had to admit that voluntary exchange did seem to have moral weight. That constant intervention felt troubling, that the vision of an ever-adjusting state was unsettling. The debate forced clarity. It showed that arguments about justice were not just about compassion or fairness in the abstract. They were about power, freedom, and what we owed one another when our interests and values diverged. While libertarians attacked Rawls from the right, another wave of critics came from the left, arguing that his theory did not go far enough. A theory of justice does not exist in a vacuum. It enters a world already thick with commitments, identities, and relationships that resist tidy abstraction. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, a wave of philosophical critics began arguing that Rawls had built something magnificent, but also something incomplete. His original position, with its veil of ignorance stripping away everything particular about human lives, had produced principles of justice that were elegantly impartial, but perhaps too much had been stripped away. Perhaps justice required attending to precisely those features of human existence that the veil concealed. The feminist philosophers arrived first with the most pointed challenge. Susan Moller-Okin, writing in 1989, observed something that should have been obvious, but had remained largely invisible in political philosophy: the family. Rawls had treated the family as part of the basic structure of society, one of the background institutions that his principles would regulate. But he had also assumed, largely without argument, that the family belonged to a private sphere where questions of justice operated differently, if at all. The household was where people pursued their conceptions of the good life, not where the state imposed principles of fairness. This assumption, Okin argued, was not neutral. It obscured systematic injustice. Women performed vastly disproportionate amounts of unpaid labor in households. They sacrificed career opportunities to raise children. They often lacked equal power in domestic decisions. And critically, this inequality within families undermined the fair equality of opportunity that Rawls promised outside them. How could society offer genuine equal opportunity when half the population started from positions structured by domestic subordination? The veil of ignorance, for all its power, had somehow failed to make gender injustice visible. Perhaps because it asked us to imagine ourselves as rational contractors deciding principles, but forgot to ask what happened when those contractors went home. The problem ran deeper than oversight. Rawls' entire framework depended on a distinction between public and private, between the political principles that governed institutions and the personal values that guided intimate life. This distinction itself, feminists argued, was gendered. It protected male privilege by placing the household beyond the reach of justice. When Rawls imagined parties in the original position choosing principles, he imagined them as heads of families. This was not accidental language. It reflected an assumption that individuals enter political society already embedded in family structures, and those structures would remain fundamentally untouched by whatever principles emerged from behind the veil. Okin proposed a corrective. Imagine parties in the original position who do not know their sex. They would recognize immediately that principles permitting systematic inequality within families threaten their most basic interests. They would insist on principles ensuring that domestic life itself met standards of fairness. Rawls, when pressed, acknowledged the force of this criticism. In later editions of his work, he clarified that the family was indeed subject to principles of justice, but the clarification raised as many questions as it answered. How much could political philosophy demand of intimate relationships without becoming tyrannical? Where did legitimate regulation of family structure end and oppressive intrusion begin? The feminist critique had exposed a tension in liberal theory itself. A different challenge emerged from the communitarians, a loose collection of thinkers including Michael Sandel, Alasdair MacIntyre, and Charles Taylor. Their objection was more fundamental. Rawls had constructed his theory around abstract individuals, rational agents stripped of all particular characteristics behind the veil. But this, the communitarians argued, was not just a useful fiction. It was a philosophical error. Human beings are not atoms who could exist independently of their social contexts. We are constituted by our relationships, traditions, and communal identities. To imagine us otherwise is to imagine something that does not exist. Sandel put the point sharply in his book Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. The self that Rawls imagined in the original position was impossibly thin, an abstraction so radically detached from its ends and attachments that it bore no resemblance to actual human beings. We do not choose our deepest commitments the way we choose items from a menu. We discover them, inherit them, find ourselves already embedded in them. Our identities are not things we construct from behind a veil. They are given to us by histories and communities we did not choose but cannot escape. A theory of justice that ignores these embedded identities will produce principles that feel alien, imposed from outside, rather than emerging from within the shared life of a community. The communitarian critique cut at the Kantian roots of Rawls's project. Kant had insisted that moral principles must be universal, equally binding on all rational beings regardless of their particular circumstances. Rawls had translated this into political terms. Principles of justice apply to all citizens of a liberal democracy, regardless of their diverse conceptions of the good. But the communitarians asked, why should we accept this? Why should justice be impartial in this way? Perhaps different communities, shaped by different traditions, should govern themselves according to different principles. Perhaps the universal aspirations of liberalism were themselves a kind of cultural imperialism, imposing one vision of the good life while pretending to neutrality. Then there were critics who accepted Rawls's egalitarian commitments, but thought he had not followed them far enough. The luck egalitarians, including G.A. Cohen and Ronald Workin, pointed out a puzzle at the heart of the difference principle. Rawls wanted to neutralize the moral arbitrariness of the natural and social lottery. No one deserves their starting place in society or their native talents. These are matters of brute luck. The difference principle tried to address this by ensuring that inequalities arising from such luck benefit everyone, especially the least advantaged. But notice what the principle permits: inequality, provided it helps the worst off. Cohen asked why we should accept this. If natural talents are morally arbitrary, if no one deserves the advantages that flow from them, why allow those who happen to be talented to keep more resources than others? The difference principle seemed to treat talented people as legitimate bargaining parties who could demand extra compensation for their efforts. But if talents are undeserved, this looks less like justice and more like extortion. The talented are permitted to withhold their productive contributions unless society pays them more. Why should justice accommodate this? Rawls had an answer, though not all found it satisfying. The difference principle was not meant to express the idea that talented people deserve more. It was a pragmatic accommodation to facts about human motivation. People will work harder and produce more if they can keep some of the fruits of their labor. This increased productivity can be arranged to benefit everyone, including those with fewer talents. The principle channels self-interest toward the common good. But Cohen pressed, is this really a principle of justice, or is it a principle of political feasibility? Has Rawls confused what justice demands with what self-interested people will accept? Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum developed a related but distinct criticism through their capabilities approach. Rawls measured justice in terms of primary goods, liberties, opportunities, income, wealth, and the social bases of self-respect. These are things that rational people need whatever else they want. But Sen pointed out a problem. People differ in their ability to convert resources into actual functionings. Give two people equal income, but one is disabled and the other is not. They do not have equal capability to live flourishing lives. The disabled person needs more resources to achieve the same level of functioning. Rawls's focus on primary goods misses this heterogeneity. Nussbaum extended this into a list of central human capabilities: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses and imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, connection with other species, play and control over one's environment. Justice on this view requires ensuring that all people have genuine capability to achieve these functionings, not merely that they have equal access to abstract resources. The capabilities approach shifted attention from what people have to what they can actually do and be. It made justice more concrete, more attentive to the messy particularity of human lives. Rawls responded to these mounting critiques with characteristic seriousness. In Political Liberalism, published in 1993, he refined his framework. He acknowledged that comprehensive philosophical doctrines, whether Kantian, utilitarian, or religious, could not provide the foundation for political principles in a pluralistic society. People disagree profoundly about the good life, about metaphysics, about human nature. A theory of justice that required accepting one particular comprehensive view would never achieve stable consensus. Instead, Rawls proposed that his principles should be understood as political, not metaphysical. They were designed for the basic structure of a democratic society, and they could be endorsed from within many different comprehensive doctrines. This was both a concession and a restatement. To the communitarians, Rawls acknowledged that abstract individualism could not ground political principles. To the feminists, he clarified that the family was indeed subject to justice. To the luck egalitarians, he maintained that the difference principle was the correct interpretation of fairness for free and equal citizens, even if more demanding egalitarian principles might apply within the sphere of personal morality. He was threading needles, trying to preserve the core insight of the original position while addressing legitimate concerns about its scope and assumptions. Not everyone was convinced. The debates continued, sharpened, evolved, but something had shifted. Even Rawls's critics largely accepted that they were working within the framework he had established. They were arguing about how to apply the veil, what to put behind it, what principles should emerge. The terrain of political philosophy had been permanently altered. Questions that seemed settled were reopened. Justice would never again be simply a matter of maximizing utility or respecting property rights. It would always involve asking what principles people would accept under conditions genuinely fair to all. Despite these challenges, Rawls's influence only grew. His framework shaped not just academic philosophy, but real-world debates about policy, law, and global justice. By the early 1990s, Rawls had spent 2 decades refining his theory of justice within the boundaries of a single, well-ordered society. The principles chosen behind the veil of ignorance were meant to govern the basic structure of domestic institutions, constitutions, property systems, tax codes, social safety nets. But the world beyond national borders pressed its own questions. What about global poverty? What about wars between nations? What about the vast inequalities between rich and poor countries? Did the same principles that demanded justice within a society also demand justice across the entire human population? Many of Rawls's readers assumed the answer was obvious. If the veil of ignorance worked domestically, why not extend it globally? Imagine not knowing which country you would be born into, whether you would grow up in Norway or Nigeria, Switzerland or Sudan. Surely rational people behind such a veil would choose principles that prevented extreme global inequality, just as they chose the difference principle to regulate inequality within a nation. The logic seemed inevitable, the moral pull irresistible. Rawls disagreed. In 1999, he published The Law of Peoples, a slim but densely argued volume that applied his method to international relations. The conclusion startled many of his admirers and delighted his critics. The difference principle, Rawls argued, does not extend beyond borders. Justice between societies operates according to different principles than justice within them. There would be no global redistribution of wealth to benefit the least advantaged people on Earth, no worldwide application of the veil of ignorance to erase the accidents of birthplace and nationality. The argument begins with a subtle but crucial shift in vocabulary. Rawls does not speak of states or nations in the traditional sense, but of peoples. A people, in his framework, is a political community united by shared institutions, a common political culture, and a conception of justice that guides its basic structure. Peoples, unlike states, are not defined by mere sovereignty or power. They are defined by their moral character, by whether their institutions respect the fundamental rights of their members and pursue reasonable aims. Rawls distinguishes between liberal peoples, who embrace constitutional democracy and individual rights, and decent peoples, who may organize themselves hierarchically but still respect basic human rights and allow meaningful participation in political life. Both deserve respect in international affairs. Why peoples rather than states? Because the traditional language of international relations treats all sovereign entities as morally equivalent actors in a realm governed solely by power and self-interest. Rawls rejects this cynical picture. He believes that some societies are organized around justice and deserve recognition as legitimate members of the international community, while others are outlaw states that flagrantly violate human rights. The question of global justice, then, is not about creating a single worldwide system that treats all individuals identically, but about establishing fair terms of cooperation among peoples who differ in their internal arrangements, but share a commitment to basic decency. This leads to Rawls's second surprising move. He applies the original position twice. First, representatives of peoples gather behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing which society they represent, to choose principles for international relations. But critically, this international original position comes after each society has already established its own internal principles of justice. The representatives know that their societies are either liberal or decent. They know their societies are committed to respecting human rights. They simply do not know which particular society they represent or what its relative size, strength, or resources might be. What principles would such representatives choose? Rawls proposes 8, including mutual recognition of independence, a duty of non-intervention, a duty to honor treaties, a duty to observe certain restrictions in war, and a duty to assist societies burdened by unfavorable conditions that prevent them from becoming well-ordered. But notice what is absent. There is no difference principle at the global level. There is no requirement that global inequalities be arranged to benefit the least advantaged people on Earth. Wealthy liberal democracies do not owe open-ended redistribution to poor but decent societies, let alone to societies that fail to respect basic rights. Why this limitation? Rawls offers several justifications, though they remain among the most contested aspects of his late work. First, he insists that the primary responsibility for a society's economic and political well-being lies with that society itself, with its political culture, its institutions, and the choices its members make over time. Some societies are poor, not because they lack resources, but because they lack effective governance, the rule of law, or a culture that supports economic cooperation. Simply transferring wealth from rich to poor nations does nothing to address these deeper structural problems, and may even enable corrupt or oppressive regimes. Second, Rawls worries about the implications of global redistribution for self-determination. If wealthy nations have an unlimited obligation to equalize global wealth, then they effectively lose control over the fruits of their own institutions and the sacrifices their members make to sustain a just society. A people that chooses to limit consumption, invest in public goods, or maintain strong social safety nets should not have those achievements indefinitely drained away to subsidize societies that make different choices. Justice, for Rawls, must respect the autonomy of peoples just as it respects the autonomy of individuals. Third, there is the question of population. Rawls notes that societies with high birth rates would perpetually claim resources from societies with low birth rates, creating perverse incentives and raising uncomfortable questions about responsibility. If a society's elite enrich themselves while neglecting the health and education of the general population, leading to persistent poverty, is that a problem of global injustice or of domestic failure? Rawls insists it is primarily the latter. The duty to assist burdened societies is real, but limited. Wealthy peoples should help societies that are struggling under unfavorable conditions to reach the threshold where they can sustain just or decent institutions. But once a society crosses that threshold, the duty ends. The goal is not global equality of wealth, but ensuring that all societies have the capacity to function as free and equal members of the international community. This is a duty of aid, not of distributive justice. The reaction among philosophers was swift and fierce. Thomas Pogge, a former student of Rawls, led the charge for cosmopolitan justice. If the veil of ignorance is a device for ensuring impartiality, Pogge argued, then it should be applied globally from the start. Why should we ask representatives to choose principles for international relations while already knowing whether their society is liberal or decent, rich or poor in resources? This stacks the deck in favor of the status quo. A truly impartial original position would place individuals, not representatives of peoples, behind a global veil where no one knows their nationality, wealth, or social position. Under such conditions, rational choosers would surely adopt a global difference principle, ensuring that worldwide inequalities work to the advantage of the least well-off human beings wherever they live. Charles Bates made a similar argument, pointing out that the global economy is now so deeply interconnected that it functions as a scheme of social cooperation spanning the entire world. Rawls himself had argued that justice applies to the basic structure of society because it profoundly shapes people's life prospects. But global trade, international finance, and transnational institutions also profoundly shape life prospects. Why then should principles of domestic justice not apply globally? The world, Bates suggested, already is a single cooperative scheme, whether we recognize it or not. Others challenged Rawls's distinction between peoples and states as overly idealistic. Many actual countries fall somewhere between the liberal ideal and outright tyranny. How should we categorize them? And what about societies where the political culture itself is shaped by centuries of colonization, exploitation, or structural disadvantage imposed by powerful nations? Can we really say that poor countries bear sole responsibility for their condition when global economic rules have been written by and for wealthy nations? Feminist philosophers questioned whether Rawls's respect for decent hierarchical societies went too far. If a society systematically subordinates women but allows some consultative political participation, does it qualify as decent? Should liberal people simply tolerate such arrangements in the name of cultural diversity? Here the tension between respecting self-determination and protecting human rights becomes acute. Rawls responded to some of these critiques with characteristic care, insisting that his account allowed for meaningful international cooperation and assistance without erasing the moral significance of political communities. He was not indifferent to suffering abroad. He simply believed that justice had different requirements at different levels of social organization, and that erasing the autonomy of peoples in pursuit of global equality would be a moral mistake, not a moral triumph. The debate continues unresolved. Some philosophers have tried to split the difference, proposing global principles less demanding than a full difference principle, but more robust than Rawls's limited duty of assistance. Others have defended Rawls, arguing that his critics underestimate the moral importance of shared political culture and overestimate the feasibility of global redistribution. The Law of Peoples remains one of the most controversial works in contemporary political philosophy, admired for its consistency and attacked for its perceived conservatism. Whether or not Rawls was right about global justice, his method, the thought experiment, the veil, the focus on fairness, had reshaped how philosophers approached the question. A thought experiment asks you to imagine something impossible, or at least improbable. You close your eyes and construct a scenario that could never exist in reality, then follow its logic wherever it leads. The trolley hurtling down the tracks, the experience machine that simulates perfect happiness, the philosophical zombie who acts conscious but feels nothing inside. These devices populate contemporary philosophy, and they do important work. They isolate variables, they test intuitions, they force us to confront what we truly believe when complications are stripped away. But they also raise an uncomfortable question. What exactly have we proven when the dust settles and we open our eyes again? The veil of ignorance is perhaps the most famous thought experiment in political philosophy, and yet from the moment Rawls introduced it, philosophers have argued about what it actually accomplishes. Is it a rigorous proof of moral principles, the way a mathematical demonstration establishes truth? Is it merely a helpful device for organizing our thinking, a heuristic that points us in the right direction without guaranteeing we will arrive at correct answers? Or is it something in between, or something else entirely, an instrument that reveals our deepest moral commitments by making visible the structure of impartial reasoning? Rawls himself was careful about these claims. He did not assert that the original position generated moral truth in some absolute timeless sense. He was not searching for principles that would be valid in all possible worlds or for all conceivable rational beings. His ambitions were both more modest and more subtle. He wanted to articulate principles that we, here and now, members of democratic societies shaped by certain traditions and commitments, could recognize as fair. The test was not metaphysical correctness, but something he called reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium is a method borrowed from epistemology and adapted for moral reasoning. The idea is that we start with considered judgments, the moral convictions we hold when we are thinking clearly and without bias. Some of these judgments are specific. Slavery is wrong, religious persecution is unjust, punishing the innocent is impermissible. Others are more general. People deserve equal consideration. Agreements made under duress are not binding. Similar cases should be treated similarly. We also have theories or principles that purport to explain and systematize these judgments. The goal is to adjust both the judgments and the principles until they fit together coherently, until we reach a state where our particular moral convictions and our general moral framework support one another in a stable way. The original position in this account is a device for achieving reflective equilibrium. It translates our commitment to fairness and impartiality into a concrete procedure. When we ask what principles would be chosen behind the veil, we are really asking what principles best capture our deepest sense of what treating people as equals requires. If the answer surprises us, if the principles conflict with some of our initial judgments, we face a choice. We can revise the principles, adjusting the thought experiment until it yields results that match our convictions, or we can revise our convictions, accepting that we were wrong about some particular case because the general principle shows us why. We move back and forth, testing and adjusting, until we reach equilibrium. This is a far cry from claiming to have discovered moral truth through pure reason. It acknowledges that moral philosophy begins with us, with our history and our commitments, and that the most we can hope for is coherence rather than certainty. Some philosophers found this modest approach refreshing, even liberating. It meant moral philosophy could proceed without settling ancient metaphysical disputes about the nature of goodness or the existence of moral facts. Others found it troublingly circular. If we are simply adjusting our principles to match our intuitions, and our intuitions to match our principles, how do we know we are making progress, rather than merely rearranging our prejudices into a prettier pattern? The circularity worry deepened when critics examined what the veil of ignorance actually conceals. Rawls strips away knowledge of social position, natural talents, conceptions of the good, and even psychological dispositions. But the parties in the original position are still rational in a specific sense. They are still choosing principles to govern social cooperation. They are still, in some fundamental way, liberal individuals making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. This means the veil might not be neutral at all. It might be smuggling in liberal assumptions about persons, rationality, and society, then presenting the principles that emerge as if they were the inevitable conclusions of impartial reason. Consider what the veil leaves intact. The parties know general facts about human psychology, economics, and social organization. They understand that people form life plans, value liberty, and need resources to pursue their goals. They are capable of a sense of justice and can be motivated by fair terms of cooperation. These are not trivial assumptions. They reflect a particular vision of human beings as separate, autonomous agents who relate to one another primarily through voluntary associations, governed by principles of reciprocity. A different tradition might start with persons embedded in communities, defined by relationships and roles, pursuing collective goods rather than individual life plans. Would those persons behind a veil designed for them choose the same principles? The worry is not merely academic. If the original position builds in liberal premises, then the two principles of justice are not discoveries but elaborations. They tell us what follows if we already accept certain views about persons and society, but they do not vindicate those views against alternatives. This matters because Rawls claimed his theory could provide common ground for people with diverse commitments. If the foundation itself presupposes liberal individualism, then anyone who rejects that starting point has no reason to accept what follows. Rawls wrestled with this challenge throughout his career. In his later work, particularly Political Liberalism, he made clearer that justice as fairness was not meant to be a comprehensive moral doctrine, true for all people, at all times. It was a political conception designed for societies already committed to certain democratic ideals. The original position was not meant to convert authoritarians or communitarians. It was meant to show those who already value fairness and reciprocity what those values entail when thought through carefully. This narrowed the ambition but also sharpened the focus. The question was not whether justice as fairness was true in some ultimate sense, but whether it accurately captured and systematized commitments we already share. Still, even within this more limited domain, questions persisted about the thought experiment's usefulness. Some critics argued it was too abstract to guide real decisions. Actual policy debates involve messy particulars. This tax rate, that welfare program, these regulations on these industries. The veil removes precisely the information we need to make informed judgments about such matters. It tells us that inequalities must benefit the least advantaged, but it does not tell us whether a higher minimum wage or expanded health coverage or progressive taxation best accomplishes that goal. The principles are so general that people with wildly different political views can all claim to be following them. Defenders responded that this was not a flaw but a feature. The original position operates at a high level of abstraction because it aims to establish fundamental principles, not specific policies. Once we accept the two principles, we must then reason carefully about empirical facts, institutional design, and likely consequences to determine what they require in practice. This is difficult work, and reasonable people will disagree, but the framework narrows the disagreement and focuses attention on what matters, not whether redistribution is justified in principle, but what forms of redistribution actually help the worst off, not whether basic liberties should be equal, but how to balance competing liberties when they conflict. There is something compelling about this defense, but also something frustrating. The veil promises to resolve deep disputes about justice by appealing to a procedure everyone can accept, yet in practice, the disputes simply reappear at a different level. We argue about whether the veil is properly designed, whether the principles it generates are correctly interpreted, whether the empirical facts support one policy or another. The thought experiment clarifies the structure of the disagreement, but it does not dissolve it. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps clarity about what we disagree about and why is the most philosophy can offer. The broader debate about thought experiments in ethics remains unresolved. Some philosophers see them as indispensable tools for isolating the morally relevant features of complex situations and testing principles against intuitions. Others worry they distort moral reasoning by removing context, ignoring relationships, and treating ethics as if it were a matter of applying rules to imaginary scenarios rather than navigating actual lives with all their particularity and nuance. The veil of ignorance embodies both the power and the peril of this method. It offers a vivid, memorable way to think about impartiality and fairness. It generates substantive principles that have influenced law, policy, and political theory. But it also invites questions about whether the scenario is rigged, whether the intuitions it elicits are reliable, and whether we have proven anything or merely illustrated what we already believed. Rawls himself seemed aware of these limitations. He revised and refined his theory over decades, responding to critics, acknowledging difficulties, adjusting his claims. He never presented the original position as the final word on justice, only as the best attempt he could make to articulate what fairness requires in terms clear enough to be debated and tested. That humility is part of the theory's enduring appeal. It invites us to use the thought experiment, to see what it reveals, and to argue about what follows. It treats moral philosophy as an ongoing conversation rather than a solved problem. As Rawls's health declined in his later years, he returned again and again to the question of justice in a pluralistic world. His final years were marked by refinement, humility, and a quiet confidence in the enduring power of his ideas. When John Rawls died in November of 2002, the obituaries struggled to capture the magnitude of what he had accomplished. He had not been a public intellectual in the usual sense. He gave few interviews, appeared on no television programs, wrote no op-eds. He had spent his career in seminar rooms and libraries, speaking to students and colleagues in a voice so quiet that listeners often leaned forward to hear him. Yet the ideas he set in motion had traveled far beyond the academy, shaping debates in courtrooms, legislatures, and newsrooms around the world. A theory of justice, published more than 3 decades earlier, had done something rare in philosophy. It had changed not just how scholars talked, but how citizens argued about the basic structure of their society. Before Rawls, political philosophy had been in a state of exhaustion. The great questions about justice and the good society seemed to have been asked and answered, or else dismissed as meaningless. Moral philosophy had fractured into technical debates about language and logic. Many believed that normative political theory was finished, that philosophy could describe how people reasoned about politics, but could not prescribe how they should. Then came Rawls with a systematic theory built on a thought experiment and a handful of principles, and suddenly the field was alive again. Graduate students flocked to political philosophy. Scholars who had written off normative questions returned to them. The sheer ambition of a theory of justice reminded everyone that philosophy could still tackle the largest problems facing human societies. The revival was not just academic. Judges cited Rawls in opinions about equal protection and distributive justice. Policymakers debated whether tax systems and welfare programs satisfied something like the difference principle. Activists invoked the veil of ignorance to argue for reforms in education, healthcare, and criminal justice. The vocabulary Rawls provided gave people a new way to articulate their intuitions about fairness. When someone says that a law or policy is unjust because it advantages those who are already privileged, they are often echoing, consciously or not, the Rawlsian insight that justice requires benefiting the least advantaged. When someone asks what rules we would choose if we did not know our own position, they are deploying the logic of the original position. Constitutional law felt the influence most directly. The American legal tradition had long grappled with how to balance liberty and equality, individual rights and collective welfare. Rawls offered a framework that placed both values in a coherent hierarchy. Basic liberties came first and could not be sacrificed for economic gains. But economic inequalities had to be justified by showing they benefited everyone, particularly the worst off. This was not a libertarian vision in which property rights trumped all else, nor a utilitarian calculus in which rights could be overridden for the greater good. It was a middle path that resonated with judges trying to interpret constitutional guarantees of equal protection and due process. Rawls himself never claimed his theory was a blueprint for American law, but legal scholars found in it a philosophical foundation for arguments about affirmative action, welfare rights, campaign finance reform, and access to education. Public policy debates shifted in subtler ways. When economists and politicians discussed inequality, the terms of the conversation began to change. It was no longer enough to say that inequality was inevitable, or that redistribution stifled growth. Now one had to explain why inequalities were justifiable, and Rawls had given a standard: they must work to the advantage of the least well-off. This did not settle the empirical questions about what policies actually achieved that goal, but it changed what counts as a legitimate defense of inequality. Trickle-down economics, for instance, could be framed as an attempt to satisfy the difference principle, arguing that policies benefiting the wealthy would ultimately raise the floor for everyone. Critics could then demand evidence that the rising tide was indeed lifting all boats, and especially the smallest ones. The argument had structure now, a shared framework even when the conclusions diverged. In journalism and everyday discourse, the veil of ignorance became a rhetorical device. Columnists asked readers to imagine themselves behind the veil when evaluating policies on immigration, healthcare, or education. The thought experiment offered a way to cut through partisan positioning and self-interest. If you did not know whether you would be born into a wealthy family or a poor one, into the majority culture or a marginalized community, what kind of society would you want? The question had a moral weight that pure appeals to self-interest lacked. It invited empathy without demanding self-sacrifice. It suggested that justice was not about helping others at your own expense, but about recognizing that you could have been in their position and they in yours. The veil also appeared in unexpected places. Activists used it to frame arguments about criminal justice reform, pointing out that no one behind the veil would choose a system that incarcerated people at the rates seen in the United States, knowing they might be among those swept up. Bioethicists invoked it when discussing healthcare rationing, asking what principles for distributing scarce medical resources people would choose if they did not know their own health status. Even corporate leaders, in moments of reflection about stakeholder capitalism and social responsibility, sometimes gestured toward Rawlsian ideas about fairness and reciprocity. This widespread influence came with a cost. The veil of ignorance, simplified and deployed in political arguments, sometimes lost the precision Rawls had given it. It became shorthand for "imagine if it happened to you," which was not quite what Rawls intended. The original position was not an exercise in empathy, but a device for modeling rational choice under conditions of fairness. The veil did not ask you to feel what it is like to be disadvantaged. It asked what principles you would rationally endorse if you might occupy any position in society. The distinction mattered. because Rawls wanted to show that justice was not just compassion but rationality itself, properly constrained. Still, the popularization of the veil was a testament to its power. Philosophical ideas that enter the wider culture are always transformed, but they also endure in ways that purely academic concepts do not. 50 years after a theory of justice, the veil of ignorance remains a fixture in philosophy classrooms. Every generation of students encounters it, usually in their first ethics course, and most find it compelling. The thought experiment has a clarity and force that cuts through the abstractions of moral theory. It does not require prior philosophical training to grasp. It asks a question that feels immediately relevant. What kind of world would you want if you could not rig the game in your favor? That question has staying power because it gets at something deep in our moral psychology, a sense that fairness involves impartiality, and that impartiality means abstracting from your particular advantages. Philosophers continue to argue about whether the veil proves what Rawls claimed it did. Some insist that the principles chosen behind the veil depend heavily on assumptions about rationality, risk, and human psychology that are themselves contestable. Others develop alternative versions of the original position, tweaking the information available or the motivations of the parties to see what principles emerge. Still others abandon the contractarian framework altogether, arguing that justice is better understood through other lenses, capabilities, recognition, care. Yet even these critics engage with Rawls, defining their positions in relation to his. That is the mark of a foundational thinker, not that everyone agrees, but that everyone must respond. Rawls himself, in his final years, expressed a kind of modest satisfaction with what he had achieved. He had not solved the problem of justice. He knew he had not ended disagreement or provided a formula that could mechanically generate the right answer to every policy question. But he had, he believed, articulated a conception of justice that free and equal citizens could reasonably endorse, a framework for thinking about the basic structure of society that respected both liberty and equality, both the individual and the collective. He had shown that normative political philosophy was possible, that it could be systematic without being dogmatic, and that it could address real problems without collapsing into mere ideology. The enduring question Rawls leaves is the one he posed at the start. What principles of justice would you choose if you did not know your place in society? It is a question that invites not just thought, but a kind of moral imagination. To ask it seriously is to step outside yourself, to suspend your knowledge of your own talents, circumstances, and advantages, and to consider the world from a standpoint that no one actually occupies but that everyone can, in principle, adopt. It is the standpoint of fairness itself. Whether or not you accept Rawls's answer, the question remains. It echoes through debates about taxation and welfare, education and healthcare, immigration and criminal justice. It asks us to think not just about what benefits us, but about what we could justify to anyone. This chapter brings us full circle, from the question posed at the beginning to the enduring relevance of that question in our divided, unequal world.